Good evening, everyone. I want to thank Francisco Burgos, Philadelphia's, Pendle Hill's Executive Director, for inviting me to be the 2021 Stephen G. Cary Memorial Lecturer. As you know, the title of my talk tonight is Radical Transformation, Long Overdue for the Religious Society of Friends. I'm going to be sharing some slides for my talk tonight. And we'll start there. I want to begin our evening with giving honor to the Lenni Lenape tribe of Pennsylvania, where I live. In their Aboriginal language, their name means true men or original people. They are called the original people because many of the traditions of the Algonquin Indian tribes say the Lenape homeland was the original birthplace of the Algonquin Indians. So the Lenapes are referred to as their grandfather tribe by various other tribes. The Lenni Lenape tribe is made up of 3 groups called clans. These clans are the turtle, wolf, and turkey. They are a part of the Algonquin people of the Anishinaabe tribe of southern Canada and northern United States. The Lenni Lenape are matrilineal, which means that every member traces their descent through their mother's line and not their father's. The Lenni Lenape tribe, also referred to as Delaware Indians, are caretakers of the land called Lenapehoking. This land expanded all the way from northern Delaware to southeastern New York and from the Atlantic Ocean to the forest of eastern Pennsylvania. They acquired the name Delaware Indians from English colonists in the Delaware Valley. The Europeans forcibly removed the majority of the Lenni Lenape tribe westward in the 1700s. Those who remained fearing the persecutions suffered by their contemporaries in the American Indian community generally kept their ancestry a well-guarded secret. The colonization of the Lenni Lenape tribe and their removal from Lenapehoking is at the root of how the American colonies were born. I'm going to share with you their standard land acknowledgement written by the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation to honor the Lenni Lenape people and territory preceding events in Lenapehoking. The land upon which we gather is part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape called Lenapehoking. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another upon this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, many were removed west and north, but some also remain among the continuing historical tribal communities of the region. The Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation, the Ramapo Lenape Nation, and the Powhatan Lenape Nation, the Nanticoke of Millsboro, Delaware, and the Lenape of Cheswold, Delaware. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief, Tamanend, that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. I would like for us to watch this slide of the map depicting the theft of Turtle Island's original indigenous homelands over the centuries, from 1776 to the present. I would like for us to sit in silence for a few minutes and feel the loss of indigenous population of Turtle Island. Now I want to give honor to my ancestors. There are three that I want to lift up tonight. My seventh great-grandfathers from Turtle Island, Thomas Pinn and Indian Charles. Thomas Pinn was born in Wicomico tribe in Wicomico Parish in Lancaster in Northumberland counties, Virginia. Indian Charles of the Nanticoke tribe lived across the Rappahannock River from the Portabago Reservation in what is now known as Caroline and King George County, Virginia. And my third great grandmother, Leah Warner from Guinea. I'm honoring them because it is their lives and spirits that are my foundation. I literally would not be here today without them, and I couldn't sustain my ministry without their examples. They and many of my other ancestors of African and Indigenous descent encountered and survived white supremacy generations before me. In order to survive, the Pinns, like other Indigenous people, were assimilated into European culture through the Episcopalian Church, resulting in them losing their Indigenous language, cultural practices, and names by being given Christian surnames. Young Indian Charles watched as the adult members of his tribe were taken from their village and sold into enslavement to the island of Antigua, West Indies. The Nanticoke tribal children were distributed by lots to the members of Virginia Governor's Council. These Indigenous orphans were by law enslaved until they reached 25. Indian Charles, along with other Nanticoke tribal children, was indentured. Leah was 12 years old in 1830 when she was kidnapped and shipped from Guinea to Bermuda. US Congress outlawed the African slave trade, making it illegal for enslaved Africans to be brought into the United States. So they were first taken to Bermuda and then sold as Caribbean enslaved in South Carolina. Leah was given her Christian name when she was sold to a man of German descent, Robert Frederick Ruth, in Beaufort, South Carolina. Leah's children watched as she was sold on the auction block by their white father to a plantation on Hilton Head, South Carolina. Then, while Leah watched, her children, Daniel and Leah, were sold on the auction block in front of her. The strength that my ancestors showed in persisting with building their lives that would produce children and support children illustrates the solid foundation that my family is built on. During these times when I feel that I have reached my breaking point, I lay on that foundation, call out to those ancestors to share their strength with me. I'm invoking them tonight for their support because I have been asked to bring a very hard message to you, one with which I have labored very deeply to hear and be faithful to share with you. I'm here tonight to tell you something that you already know. Many of our systems no longer serve us well. It is time for a transformation. We are living through a tumultuous period of a global pandemic, global extreme wildfires, global floods, increasing numbers of tornadoes in areas that traditionally have not experienced them, global drought, and more frequent and severe global earthquakes. Our climate is shifting more quickly than scientists expected. Our Earth is transitioning underneath our feet. Are we listening to her? I would say that the majority of us are not. We want our lives to return to what many of us call normal. A normal that is based on a capitalistic system centered on material commodification, replication of extractive techniques as a form of economic development for European nations, and based on a system of assets with land and labor being the key commodities. A white, dominantly controlled structure designed to oppress by skewing the availability of resources in favor of white people. Colonization and capitalism are the root of our major global problems today. Racism and white supremacy have been established as our system of power. White supremacy, racism, colonization, and capitalism are all systems being implemented internationally. These systems were created by European countries to build their economies and reserves. Belgium, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain all had a role in colonizing several continents, including Africa and Turtle Island. What are the elements that have contributed to the colonization of Turtle Island, now referred to as the Americas, which helped establish white supremacy? Let's look back in our history to the Crusades, a series of religious wars initiated by Pope Urban II between Christians and Muslims, started primarily to secure control of holy sites considered sacred by both groups. There were 8 major crusade expeditions that occurred between 1096 and 1291. During these wars, Muslim Moors were considered less human than the Christian soldiers. In the 15th century, the doctrine of discovery was established. It was a series of papal bulls giving European Christian colonizers the right to take land and other resources and to convert or kill non-Christian inhabitants. There were 3 papal bulls that occurred between 1452 and 1493. These papal bulls supported the credence that non-Christians were considered enemies of the Catholic faith and, as such, less than human. Pope Nicholas directed King Alfonso to capture, vanquish, and subdue the Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to put them into perpetual slavery, and to take all their possessions and property. The doctrine of discovery is the seed of white supremacy and capitalism. It gave Europeans the right to colonize both Africa and Turtle Island, implementing the commodification of land and people, making them all property through state-sanctioned structural violence. The 1845 Manifest Destiny philosophy, which drove the westward and southern invasions, held that the United States was destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism throughout the Northern American continent, dispossessing indigenous tribes of their collective sovereign land, supporting European invaders' sense of entitlement and practice of accumulating wealth from stolen people on stolen land. It was believed to be both justified and inevitable. This policy grew out of and was based on the doctrine of discovery. As we know, the doctrine of discovery was used to colonize the continents of Africa and the Americas. It comes to manifest itself in the lives of indigenous, it continues to manifest itself in the lives of indigenous people today. In 2004, the Delaware Nation of Oklahoma and Anadarko filed a lawsuit against the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This Delaware Nation based its lawsuit on the doctrine of discovery and the royal charter that King Charles II of England issued to William Penn in 1681. In the preamble of Penn's charter, King Charles II speaks of the charter's purpose and Penn's alleged intentions, which were to enlarge our English empire, to provide useful goods, and to civilize and Christianize the savage native. That charter gave William Penn sovereignty over land that had not yet been colonized and dominated by Christendom. Some of you may know that William Penn's sons, John, Thomas, and Richard, illegally expanded their father's territory through what is referred to as the walking purchase. The walking purchase expanded Penn's original colony by tricking the Lenni Lenape into giving up a large portion of their territory by creating fraudulent documents which allowed them to legally steal a portion of the Lenape Nation's land. This 2004 court case concerned those fraudulent documents, and though the court recognized in its ruling the illegitimacy and fraudulency of the walking purchase, they ruled that the indigenous tribes did not have any right to the land in the first place. Indigenous peoples, or quote unquote savage native, had the legal right to occupy land, but no right to own it. Also, in 2005, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg cited the landmark 1823 decision in City of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation of New York. The ruling held that the repurchase of tribal lands did not restore tribal sovereignty. Indigenous people, along with the World Council of Churches and several Friends meetings, continue to fight for the doctrine's revocation. As you can see, the doctrine erected barriers between Europeans and people of color by calling some Christians human and non-Christians non-human, creating the legal religious, political, social, and economic ethical framework that justified white supremacy, establishing the devastating pattern of natural resource extraction, enslavement, forced labor, separating families, and genocide. These violent patterns of dehumanization created systems of oppression that were established and are maintained by fear and massacre. My ancestors endured the governmental removal from their ancestral lands, separation of children from their parents, enslavement, and cultural genocide through assimilation. These patterns of accumulating wealth from stolen land, stolen resources, and the exploitation of people's labor facilitated the development of commerce and industry in the world, providing the backbone of our global economy. We continue to rely on these practices today. You may be wondering what this has to do with the Religious Society of Friends. In my visits to several yearly meetings this summer, I observed 4 common threads. The Religious Society of Friends is getting smaller. We struggle to attract and maintain youth and people of color. The number of people who have the time and resources to volunteer is shrinking. Our structure of volunteer-run committees is not able to find the number of people we need to serve for the committees to fully function. It is clear to me that our current structures are failing us. Continuing revelation is a core principle in the Religious Society of Friends. We need to be using it to assist us with invoking the transformation Quakerism is currently crying out for. The lack of Friends' engagement with our structure, which is fundamental to nurture a dynamic Religious Society of Friends, is alarming. Right now, I find the Religious Society of Friends to be a lot like the mythical melting pot. People are welcome to become Quakers if they're willing to assimilate. Why is addressing white supremacy and privilege important? Because it affects the number of African Americans who are drawn to and remain in the Religious Society of Friends. Why does that matter? Because the continued existence of the Religious Society of Friends relies on being a religion that attracts and nurtures people of color as our population grows and the European Americans decrease. There are very few of us here within the United States of America and Canada. This is not a new phenomenon. In 1850, an article was published in the July 20th issue of the Friends Review, which said, "It is a remarkable circumstance that although the members of our religious society have been so long and so extensively known as the advocates of the colored race, and the discipline established among us presents no impediment to their reception into membership, which is not equally applicable to persons of European origin. Still, the number of colored persons found within the society has always been exceedingly small. This circumstance may justly raise the inquiry whether the cause lies with them or with us. Is the religion of Friends unsuited to the colored race, or are they kept at a distance by our neglect or repulsive conduct?" Quakerism was definitely suited to people of African descent. Catherine Gerbner, in her book, Christian Slavery, Conversion and Race in the Protestant Atlantic World, illustrates the intersections between West African and Quaker religiosity. She asserts a handful of common characteristics between African, Caribbean, and Quaker practices. People of African descent were being kept at a distance because the majority of Friends were and have behaved like the average American of European descent. Some Quakers believed in freedom for the enslaved. However, for the most part, Friends believed that Africans and people of African descent are not equal to people of European descent. Let's look at the roots of African descendants' experiences within Quakerism in the Caribbean and United States of America. First, Friends owned, sold, traded, and captured enslaved Africans. English Quakers considered enslavement necessary for their economic development. Then, Friends established regular meetings for worship for people of African descent for only those who they enslaved in 1675 in the West Indies. Initially, Africans and people of African descent were not allowed to become members of the Religious Society of Friends until 1784. Also, worship for African descendants took place in separate meeting houses, or if they were invited to worship in a meeting house with people of European descent, they were placed in segregated sections in the back or balcony during the 18th and 19th centuries in the United States of America. Friends were good about donating money and their time to establish schools for people of African descent. However, for the most part, were hesitant to admit children of African descent into Quaker schools. This is expressed in the words of Samuel Ringgold Ward, who escaped on the Underground Railroad to become an abolitionist. Ward stated, "The Quakers will give us good advice. They will aid in giving us a partial education, but never in a Quaker school beside their own children. Whatever they do for us savors of pity and is done at arm's length." It was not until the middle of the 20th century that Friends admitted students that were not of European descent in the majority of their schools on the East Coast. Changes have occurred within the Religious Society of Friends since the 17th century. People of African descent can become members of Friends meetings. We can sit wherever we choose in meeting houses, and our children are educated in Quaker schools alongside white children. However, there are still walls in Friends communities. They seem invisible to many and thus more difficult for some to see. The walls are the system of white supremacy that provides greater access to power and resources for people of European descent. The system that tells us this behavior is normal, encouraging us to support it by being complicit and not question the patterns of how we live our daily lives. What are some of these patterns? As I stated earlier, Friends were involved in all aspects of the system of enslavement. Quakers contributed to the seizure of land from indigenous tribes, invested their money in banks and insurance companies, supporting ships that transported enslaved Africans as cargo to the Caribbean and Turtle Island. Friends also profited from the shipping industry that carried enslaved Africans from Africa to the Caribbean and Turtle Island. Catherine Gerbner, in her book, Christian Slavery, Conversion, and Race in the Protestant Atlantic World, talks about the Friends who colonized Barbados, needing labor for their sugar plantations. There was a large Quaker presence on Barbados, where thousands of Friends lived. In the 1670s, it was called the Nursery of Truth because it was so filled with Quakers. "80% of those Quakers in Barbados owned enslaved Africans. Many of us know that in 1671, George Fox traveled to the island where he urged Quakers to consider manumission, but he did not call for an end to the practice of enslavement. Fox commended Friends to worship with the enslaved people in their households and to introduce them to Quakerism. When Pennsylvania was founded in 1682, William Penn and others used their Quaker connections in Barbados to purchase enslaved Africans. As Pennsylvania's social and economic structure developed, ties with the West Indies and other trade channels flourished. The trade with Barbados was a source of pride and a symbol of prosperity for many English Quakers who considered enslavement to be necessary for economic development. Also, colonists from Barbados relocated their wealth, enslaved Africans, and pro-enslavement ideologies to William Penn's new American colony when they settled in Pennsylvania. Gerbner reminds us that whiteness was created in order to legalize and justify inequality. She further states that this history invites us to think about what it really means to combat oppression. This also means confronting the uncomfortable aspects of Quaker history. When we relegate the blame for slavery and oppression to people in the South, for example, we are actively erasing Quaker complicity in and support for enslavement, not only in Barbados, but also in Philadelphia and elsewhere in the North. This is an uncomfortable past, but it's a past that needs to be brought into the light. Looking carefully at this Quaker past can teach us a lesson about social justice. It shows us that it's not enough to be radical. We also have to be vigilantly aware of history and the complexities of inequality. It's not enough to have good intentions. We must critically engage with the past to understand the influence it continues to exert in the present. For centuries, friends of African descent have been telling us that normal is damaging. We have struggled to be received into membership. William Bowen, enslaved from birth to adulthood at the age of 28, applied for membership with Mount Holly Monthly Meeting in New Jersey in 1763. His application was rejected. Friends encouraged him to continue to be faithful. Then, in 1781, Abigail Franks applied for membership with Birmingham, Pennsylvania Meeting. It took 3 years, 4 committees, and was passed up the hierarchy of Pennsylvania Quakers to the highest level, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, to discern if she should be accepted into membership. Philadelphia Yearly Meeting agreed to accept her into membership in 1784. Then, finally, 51 years later, in 1814, Mount Holly Monthly Meeting accepted William Bowen's membership application just 10 years prior to his death. In the 1840s, Sarah Mapps Douglas, an African American educator, scholar, artist, abolitionist, and attender of Quaker Meeting in Philadelphia, who, with her mother, shared her feelings that it was unchristian to take away the freedom of choice from African Americans in a house of worship by making them sit in designated sections restricted only to people of African descent. She also shared her mother's belief that this practice kept African Americans away from Quakerism. On December 14, 1843, Douglas wrote a letter to the National Anti-Slavery Standard, which was published. One of the statements Douglas made was, "I have frequently heard my mother say that very many of our people incline to Friends' mode of worship. She lamented the unchristian conduct that kept them out. Some have gone out from Friends, but not because they prefer their own meetings, where they regularly hear singing and preaching, but because they could not bear the cross of sitting on the black bench. Ah, there are many poor, stray, starving sheep wandering in this world's wilderness who would gladly come into your green pastures and repose them by your still waters. Did not prejudice bar the entrance. I am persuaded the Lord has controversy with Friends on this account. Let them see to it." Barrington Dunbar, a member of 57th Street meeting in Chicago, Illinois, spoke out at a time when the civil rights movement was transforming into a struggle for self-governance. African Americans were fighting to have the privileges and as many opportunities as European Americans have available to them and the power of choice. Friends of European descent, who were used to making the decision of which option was available for people of African descent and then helped implement them, did not understand this shift. They felt that African Americans were rejecting them and everything they represented. Who do Friends represent during this period? The European American power structure. This was a time when African Americans were very distrustful of people of European descent, especially those involved in religion. Christianity was and is seen as the tool used for genocide, enslavement, and colonization of people of color. For centuries, European American Quakers have treated African Americans as if they were unable to make good decisions about their lives. Now, African Americans were focusing on self-determination by demanding the right to make their own decisions about their lives. I will share with you an excerpt from an essay, Quaker Response to Racial Crisis, that Dunbar wrote in 1969 for a book that Friends World Committee for Consultation published on themes that engrossed their 1967 triennial at Guilford. Radical justice was one of the themes chosen, and they asked Barrington to write an essay addressing that theme for them. This essay shows his frustration and disappointment with Friends and their attitudes towards racial justice and their fear of the Black Power movement. A revolution of great magnitude is in progress in the United States. What has been the response of the Society of Friends to this revolution? For the most part, the members of the Society of Friends have been content to be white liberals. Though they have advocated marginal reforms, they've accepted the American system, the legitimacy of its basic values and institutions. They have accommodated to the poor housing, inadequate schools, and squalor and ghettos adjacent to their suburban communities. But they have not been able to act forcefully for civil rights for fear of losing social status and incurring the disfavor of their neighbors. Conformity has been a dead weight around their necks. Living thus, Friends have not experienced the degradation and frustration inherent in the total experience of Black people in America, and they fail to understand Black power, which they equate with arrogance, violence, and separateness. It is with respect to the question of violence, as advocated by some ultranationalists, that Friends have found Black power most objectionable. Institutional racism in America is covert violence, the day-to-day violence that has been perpetuated by white on Black Americans for over 300 years. Friends have accommodated to it. They have lost their revolutionary faithfulness and have unwittingly become allies in maintaining a violent society. We friends are therefore guilty of our kind of violence. Dwight Spann Wilson was the General Secretary of Friends General Conference, a Quaker umbrella organization that provides services for its member meetings in the United States of America and Canada. He talked about his isolation within Quakerism and his frustration with having to reject his African American culture and assimilate into the white middle class culture to be a member of the Religious Society of Friends in the 1980s. Wilson said, "I also feel isolated because as I have traveled hundreds of thousands of miles, I haven't seen 75 Black Quakers yet. You can't know how it feels to be surrounded almost all the time with faces that don't look like yours. I don't expect freckles, but I would like to have some more Blacks. Sometimes when I'm weak, I want to say, God, why did you send me here? I don't know. I know I was sent. I know I want to stay, but I wonder why we don't have more Blacks. And I feel isolated too, because all my life I've been taught that I have to adapt to white society. And sometimes I wonder, when is somebody going to adapt to me? How come I always have to be the one to make the changes? Why do people never try to understand me?" In 2002, Bill Brown, a former attender of West Falmouth Preparative Meeting under the care of Sandwich, Massachusetts monthly meeting, in his article, "What Do Quakers Owe Blacks?" says, "I do not expect a radical epiphany that will reveal us as people. Without a doubt, the subject of racism is emotional. Therefore, I expect that Quakers will have the emotional and spiritual strength not to tell me that race is not a part of Quaker consciousness. I am caught in the dilemma of trying to be a loving and trusting Quaker in a religious home that seems not to understand my most fundamental needs: shelter in a perilous time, comfort from the cyclical cause and effect relationship of class and color, and a stable location in the human family. Quakers may not have slandered, persecuted, or denounced Blacks, but there was a coziness with racism that was certainly within the pivotal degrees of cooperation with the status quo. Racism is a virus that quietly lurks in the Society of Friends." Valerie Brown, a Buddhist and Quaker teacher, retreat leader, leadership coach, writer, and founder of Lead Smart Coaching, also a member of Salisbury, Pennsylvania meeting, in her March 2020 Friends Journal article titled "How to Be an Inclusive Quaker," wrote, "I have come to understand that when I arrive at Quaker worship, I bring my whole self, both the fullness of my identity and my life experiences. As a person who identifies as Black and a woman, largely operating in the dominant white culture of Quakerism in Philadelphia, I have become aware of the unwritten norms that underlie Quaker faith and practice, and worship in particular. There are times in a meeting for worship and elsewhere when I feel downright rageful, triggered by someone's good intentions that either fall flat on me leave me scratching my head in curiosity or shaking in the heat of my own anger. Not only do we need to learn skills to care for ourselves and our emotions in the moment, but we also need to understand that those good intentions, even when spirit-led, are not a license to ignore their unintended impact on others. Even as we gather for meeting for worship and offer spirit-led vocal ministry, this too is within a broader societal context of structures, systems, and institutions that further oppression and racialization. A reframe for Quakers would be to take a deeper exploration of our good intentions. How do our intentions affect others, either intentionally or unintentionally? How might we look deeper at our intentions and align them with our values? What do we do individually and as a corporate body when this happens? How might our good intentions further support our own implicit bias? This is just a sample of the many voices of friends of African descent who have for centuries asked for systemic change in the Religious Society of Friends. As I read the words of these friends, I feel tremendous sadness in how relevant they continue to be today. As a result of this pandemic, several friends of color have left their predominantly white meetings. In the midst of such despair and turmoil, our collective trauma, exhaustion, sadness, and anger has increased. As we checked in with each other after worship that week and up to the writing of this article, more friends of color have expressed the importance of the people of color spaces FGC is providing. Friends of color are finding it harder to be in predominantly white environments, including our Quaker meetings, because they are no longer feeling nurtured in those environments. Now that I have done this research and have a better understanding of our full history, I see why friends of African descent continue to be affected by racism in the Religious Society of Friends today, and hope you have a better understanding too. Our ancestors have left us the system. It is going to take specific actions on our part to dismantle those systems and create a more equitable world. Change will come only with deliberate attention and effort. Because the issue is so broad, it is not possible for any individual or any single organization to possess all the capacities and resources needed to achieve racial equity. It is time for us to rearrange, replace, or remove some practices in Quakerism. Friends of color and of European descent need to examine our practices and, with the guidance of friends of color, decide which ones are essential aspects of the religion without which Quakerism could not exist. Members of the Religious Society of Friends of European descent established and have controlled Quakerism since its inception. Even though the majority of Quakers in the world today are friends of color, these friends are located in the global South and have limited financial resources. The Friends Church there was established by missionaries and remains closely controlled by those Quakers of European descent. A part of that control has involved inviting people of color to join the religion on their terms. People of European descent have made the decisions for people of color in the Religious Society of Friends for over 300 years. It is time to co-create a religion that reflects all of us. Addressing racism in the Religious Society of Friends is as turbulent as ending enslavement was for our community. Sadly, that process took 100 years. Friends were not ready to question their practice of enslavement because so many of them were involved in the economics of enslaving Africans. It took many years and a change in leadership for this attitude to transform. The work continued gradually, step by step. Quakers prohibited individual aspects of the enslavement industry. It is also important to remember the motivation for that work as we move forward with our transformation. Friends abolished enslavement to preserve the purity of the Religious Society of Friends, not to restore freedom for Africans and African Americans, because the Religious Society of Friends as a whole was not concerned for the well-being of the enslaved African. In many ways, the seed of enslavement, genocide, and whiteness all came from the tree of white supremacy. The transformation of sight is often a painful process, just as all true growth is. Culture shapes the way we order our life, interpret our experiences, and evaluate the behavior of other people. One of the benefits of privilege that comes with white skin in America is being sheltered from having to engage with race-based stress. According to Robin DiAngelo, white people in North America live in a social environment that protects and isolates them from race-based stress. This isolated environment of racial protection builds white expectations for racial comfort, while at the same time lowering the ability to tolerate racial stress, leading to what she referred to as white fragility. White people tend to confuse comfort with safety, but it is rare that these situations are actually unsafe. They're uncomfortable because we aren't accustomed to that level of discourse. When you engage with difficult topics, as we are doing right now, you develop a more muscular approach to staying engaged. An increased understanding of our present and of our history ushers in new levels of discomfort. Learning to respond in a healthy way to the internal chaos aroused by our awakenings is an important step forward. American culture tends to hide the stories of guilt and shame and seeks to evaluate stories of success, which result in amnesia about a tainted history. This practice is exactly why Donna McDaniel and I decided to research and write Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship, Quakers, African Americans, and the Myth of Racial Justice. We wanted to disrupt our normal white culture by presenting a publication that shared the full history of the relationship between Quakerism and African Americans with all of its complexity. I'm thankful for the opportunity to dispel the myths generated about this relationship. However, I knew that Fit for Freedom was going to be a difficult book for some friends to read. The information we were disclosing was hard for me to digest as an African American, yet it explained so much. I wondered if European Americans would retreat in their white fragility, or would they be resilient? I can say that more friends were resilient than I expected. Friends of African descent have been asking for change in this country and the Religious Society of Friends for centuries. As a person of color in the Religious Society of Friends, I need you to be resilient, to walk alongside those of us who have no choice but to move forward and to stick to the hard work of separating whiteness from white supremacy. As Daniel Hill states in his book, White Awake, an honest look at what it means to be white. The resilient person not only recovers from disruption, but persists through it. I want you to have the vision to see things differently. Be open to listening in new ways and understand things outside of the context of white culture. Your goal should prioritize flexibility. Step outside of your white cultural boundaries. Test yourself constantly to see how flexible you truly are. When you feel your white fragility surfacing, notice it, let it pass through you, and take the risk of making a different choice. Instead of defending your intention, apologize. Let go of your defensiveness and focus on how your actions have impacted others, regardless of how good your intentions were. It is time for all of us to truly begin living our testimony of equality, or what I prefer, equity. We must build a religious society of friends where everyone feels welcome for who they are. One that does not cause people to leave a major part of themselves or their cultural identity outside the door. Let's begin to identify and separate the aspects of Quakerism that are not related to the core of our beliefs. The non-essential Eurocentric practices that have been attached to the way we practice our faith. Just as we talked about separating whiteness from white supremacy. Once those are removed, we can, together, people of color and of European descent, rebuild Quakerism and the world into an equitable and peaceful home. For us to begin this journey of transformation, it will be important for us to know and understand our own individual cultural heritage. We also need to have an honest understanding of how our ancestors contributed to this world and the structure of white supremacy. How we continue to maintain vestiges of this structure in our behaviors today. It is only possible to change a system once you have a clear understanding of how it operates. Acknowledging the pain and celebrating the accomplishments will help us be able to transform members of the religious society of friends and eventually the inhabitants of the world into peaceful human beings. Awareness of white supremacy is not static. It is a process. We all are someplace in this process, and everyone benefits when we grow. So get involved. Educate yourselves through reading books, watching movies, and shows by and about people of color. Participate in classes, workshops, discussions, conferences, and other activities that identify white supremacy and promote racial justice. Center people of color voices and lived experiences. Decolonize one's mind from accepting whiteness as part of normalcy. Co-create alternative paths for acceptance, reflections, and actions. Move beyond diversity and inclusion to racial representation. Create alternative power structures, practices, and accountability. The time for transformation is now. We must change now before we lose more friends of color from the Religious Society of Friends. When I joined Quakerism, there was one Friends organization that focused on people of African descent. The Fellowship of Friends of African Descent. The fellowship was formed from a gathering at Pendle Hill in 1990. Its original purpose having been fulfilled, it then transferred into an organization that seeks to bear witness to the divine presence in all through an African-oriented experience within the Religious Society of Friends by worship, education, activism, and service. In the past 10 years, Friends of Color established another organization, Ujima Friends Peace Center, and participated in the establishment of separate Quaker events. In the past 18 months, space for Friends of Color to worship, participate in worship sharing, and socialize have been created within Zoom, including the formation of a new virtual meeting, Ujima Friends Meeting. All of these spaces have been necessary to contribute to Friends of Color remaining in the Religious Society of Friends. Through these gatherings and organizations, we have been strengthening our connections to Quakerism and one another. Are we seeing a new branch of the Religious Society of Friends? Is this the direction we want to go? Currently, it is what several Friends of Color need to remain within Quakerism. How will the transformation we need transpire? We must disrupt the dominant narrative of white supremacy within the Religious Society of Friends. Through continuing revelation, we can be open to new experiences, exhibit readiness to learn patterns of new behavior that include embracing doubt and uncertainty. It is time for the Religious Society of Friends to acknowledge that this is a global issue and approach it that way. I have been attending Britain Yearly Meeting for many years. They too, as a yearly meeting, are addressing racism as well as the Quaker Council for European Affairs in Brussels. Let's come together across the continents, combine our resources and energy, recognize the harm that colonization continues to perpetuate, and our responsibility to develop systems for the reallocation of the wealth Friends gained from the theft of Indigenous land, raw materials, and stolen labor. The other day, a member of Ujima Friends Peace Center and attender of Ujima Friends meeting at the Fellowship of Friends of African Descent annual gathering talked about transformation using the example of a butterfly. I envision our transformation to occur much as a metamorphosis does for a caterpillar. Not just any caterpillar, but a tobacco hornworm. Why a tobacco hornworm? Because a scientific study found that associative memory survives their metamorphosis into a California sphinx moth, or more commonly known, a hawk moth. The University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences describes the life cycle of the moth as beginning with a fertilized egg, which turns into a caterpillar that eats continuously, molting, shedding its outgrown skin 4 to 6 times before the formation of the pupal cell. Once the pre-pupal stage transitions into the pupal stage, the insect's cuticle hardens and darkens, forming the pupa. During this stage, the old body parts of the caterpillar go through an incredible change called metamorphosis. Inside the pupa, the caterpillar digests itself, releasing enzymes to dissolve all of its tissues. Certain highly organized groups of cells, known as imaginal discs, survive the digestive process. Before hatching, when a caterpillar is still developing inside its egg, it grows an imaginal disc for each of the adult body parts it will need as a mature moth. Discs for its eyes, for its wings, its legs, and so on. Once a caterpillar has disintegrated all of its tissues except for the imaginal discs, those discs use the protein-rich soup all around them to fuel the rapid cell division required to form the wings, antennae, legs, eyes, genitals, and all the other features of an adult moth. I see our testimonies of simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, which I alter to equity, and leadership as the imaginal discs. Our meetings are going to feel like a soupy mess as we digest our structure, examining which ones hold us up and which ones no longer serve us because they hold us back from co-creating our new wings, antenna, etc. Our process will be helped by having community guidelines in place to serve as our pupa as we live into our practice of continuing revelation and reconstruct ourselves with all of us, our cultures and values being digested together. This process may take longer than expected for us to emerge from our pupa as a fully formed adult California sphinx or hawk moth. But when we do, we will be a stronger religious society of friends for doing that messy work of transformation together. I'm excited for this metamorphosis. Let us work to change our pattern of relating with one another to one that honors freedom, equity, integrity, and peace. Speak to that of God in each person and honor their humanity. The legacy of white supremacy is within all of us, and it is going to take all of us working together to remove the barrier it has constructed and preserves. I know that the Religious Society of Friends has the faith and trust of continuing revelation to co-create a transformed religious community. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Vanessa, for this wonderful lecture. I know that questions are coming our way, and we will be having giving you a couple minutes to drink a sip of water as we curate these questions. But there is one that was posted as we were talking here, and it has to do with, based on your own experience, what do you consider to be a white Eurocentric practice that should be discarded as no core to Quakerism?
Thank you, Francisco. So actually, some of them that I did speak about within the talk, and one for me is primary and it's actually something that our young friends I know within Philadelphia yearly meeting have used is no decision about us without us. And that there are times where decisions are made within the Religious Society of Friends about people of color without consulting with us to see what we would like. And so I also want to acknowledge that we are not a monolith. So you can't just go to one friend of color and say, this is what we're thinking of doing, and what do you think about that, and should we be doing it? And that you need to talk with several of us, because we are all different. And my views are not necessarily even my husband's views, and African American Quaker as well. So we're just like folks that are European American and are in our meetings where we don't always agree when we're making decisions.
Associated to, or as a follow-up to that question, what is your vision of a liberatory faith? What a person of color find when they walk into our current system of meeting house, that the majority are European descent. And you spoke a little bit about the experience of other friends on that situation, as you were sharing what Dwight Wilson, for example, was saying. But what is Vanessa's voice on this issue?
So a religious society of friends where any of us can come into and be able to feel like, wow, this is a place where I want to be, and to see that it is a place where if something occurs that is upsetting or uncomfortable, that is something that can be talked about and to be dealt with. To not do. One of the things that I have experienced in Quakerism is our fear of conflict, and that we will do whatever we can to avoid or ignore it, which for me then just makes it worse. So, but to be able to have an environment when there is something that comes up, that we don't sweep it under the rug, that we do deal with it, we do step into the discomfort, because that's what builds community. So being nice and smiling but yet distant and not relating with each other on a basis where you're able to be honest and truthful with each other, even when sometimes it's painful or challenging, doesn't serve us well. Doesn't serve me well.
Can you share any good example of what Friends communities are doing at the grassroots level to generate awareness about this racial dynamic within our Friends community?
That's a good question. So I have been very involved with spaces for friends of color since COVID. And I can say that as we were meeting and spending time with each other, one of the things that we realized is that it was important for us as a community to have guidelines. So we as a group, a small group came up with some guidelines and then brought them to the larger group, and we went through them and changed them some, but it's something that when we get together, we use. And I do know that there are other spaces like Pacific Yearly Meeting this summer during their sessions had a practice that they put into place during their business sessions for trying to provide space for when issues came up, to be able to mostly focused racially around, for instance, microaggressions, to be able to address them there in the moment when they happened. So I can say definitely that Pacific Yearly Meeting as a group that is trying to work on that. And I know that there are other yearly meetings too that have reached out and asked them about their practice, and so they're doing some work to try and share that.
Some of our friends over YouTube ask, how do you define equality/equity in the context of the things that you have been highlighting for us?
Thank you. So equity is actually different than equality for me. And actually for me is, I prefer that, because equality means if you have a pie and there are 10 people there, then you just slice that pie into 10 slices, 10 equal slices, and everybody gets a slice. But if you have, a baby who doesn't need a slice, then why are you giving a slice to a baby or to someone who's really hungry and hasn't eaten well that could use actually 2 slices? That you are not supporting either the baby or the person who needs to have more food by giving them equal pieces. So instead, just slicing the pie in a way that meets everyone's actual needs who's present there in that space.
There is another question here. Again, the questions not necessarily represent one single individual, but the curation of the question as they are coming to us. How can American friends step out of white supremacy when we accept the Constitution of the United States, which states that Black people count for 3/4 of a vote in this country?
And not only that, but also that indigenous people, are heathens. So yeah, it would be great for us to have a new constitution, because actually that was written for the 1%, and not for the masses at large. So to rewrite, that's a part of the reason why it's challenging to get it to fit our society, and not just the 1% of the land owning, cis-gender, heterosexual, Christian white male, landowning Christian white males for whom it was actually written to push back on Britain and give them the rights that they felt Britain was keeping them from having, but not caring about the rights for people who were outside of their circle.
You mentioned the word transformation, and you guide us tonight through a long history of wrongdoing within our faith community. How can we envision a way forward while providing a space for transformation to the history that we are carrying with us?
Well, first of all, I would say that there's not just one way forward. So that there are many ways forward, and that the community, whether it's your monthly meeting, your quarterly meeting, yearly meeting, or Quaker organization, needs to think about, how to move forward, and also to know that, as I'd said, around with the pupa, that it's going to be messy and it's not going to be perfect, and that we're going to step out and try some things, and some are going to work and some are not going to work, and so that we have to also use our continuing revelation and say, ooh, we thought this was a good idea, but this is not giving us the results that we want to have, and so what is it we need to do to shift our plans so that we are able to have the results that we would like to have, and sometimes those shift as well. So I know one of the things that Friends General Conference is doing, and I know several monthly and yearly meetings are doing as well, is that we have a query that we use when we're making decisions that basically asks, how the decision that we're making helps the organization be anti-racist. And so we, in the beginning, when we first came up with that, we're not implementing it very often, but now we've gotten a much better practice of using it. And at times finding that the answer is, it doesn't. So even if it was something that we're invested originally in moving forward on, then have said, so then we're not going to use our resources for this because it is not fulfilling the query and the goal that the organization has set forward. So
there is a question here that is more personal. How does the Spirit support you as you carry on this ministry?
Well, in many ways. One, as I said earlier, was knowing what my ancestors went through, and if great-great-grandmother could survive the Middle Passage, and that things that seem and feel really difficult for me, that at least I don't have that struggle. But there are also processes that I have in place. So that my meeting, Central Philadelphia, when it designated that I did have a ministry in 2000, gave me not only a travel minute, but also a committee. And so I meet with that support and accountability committee on a monthly basis, except for summer. Everything in Central Philadelphia shuts down during the months of July and August. But I meet with them, and they support me. They also hold my feet to the fire. So sometimes I'll get a request and I'll take it to them, and they look at my schedule and say, unless you're dropping something, no, you're not going to take this on. Also, how's your family feeling about this? This means more time away from your family. So having them is really important, as well as there are other friends out there in general all over the world who I find very supportive, some of whom we come together and talk about our ministries with each other. I was sharing with one that how frustrated I was that tonight's talk was coming to me in little pieces here and there, and I just wanted it to all come in. I could sit down at the computer and write it and it would be there. And no, that didn't happen. And it was really helpful to hear them say, oh my goodness, that happens to you too. And so to get that validation that, it's not just me. So my recommendation is that if any of you are here who feel that you might have a ministry, to first, what I did was I had a clearness committee that was from my meeting, which actually was really important because going through that process helped me be clear that I had a ministry. I didn't care about the meeting, but I went into it in thinking that it was important for the meeting, but it actually turned out to be really important for me. And so I'm thankful for that, and I'm thankful for having the accountability and support committee. I could not do it without them. I could not do it without my family, especially my wonderful husband, who is so amazing with being okay with me before COVID, being on the road every month and traveling and doing work. And so I'm blessed.
That's great. And I think that we will start winding down here, but there are, I want to present to you a last question that is a little bit complex, yeah? The first part of this question has to do with what can be called as integration between African descendants friends and European descendants friends. Like, how are we looking at those collaboration, integration, when we are at the same time looking at creating affinity space within our community? Because for some friends, this can be a little bit confused. And the part B of that question is, how can we, in the space for transformation, address in today's society and in our current history, the needs for contemporary abolition and reparation?
Okay, so I will speak to the first one, and then you're going to have to repeat the second one when it comes time to answer that. I would say that we don't have integration in the Religious Society of Friends at this point. One of the things that I found in doing the research for Fit for Freedom was the Quaker school considered itself integrated when it had one child enter kindergarten. So one child, and the whole rest of the school was white. they consider it integrated. And so, you know, that is a lot of where we are now within the Religious Society of Friends. And within our Quaker meetings, there's maybe one, two, if you're fortunate, a handful of friends of African descent within the meeting. So as a result, then you, as a person of color, for me, and as others said, that's isolating. Just as we as Quakers, you know, I know in going to some yearly meetings, friends are like, oh, it's so great to be together. Well, why is it important to be together? Because some are in communities where they are isolated and they may be the only Quaker within their neighborhood or that they may even know in their city. And so having an opportunity to come together with other Quakers is affirming and also important in being able to be with other folks who practice religion the way that you do. So the spaces that we have created for Friends of Color are no different than that. No different than when there are men's groups or there are women's groups, that in our society, there are many different ways, or parents coming together and wanting to be together in a parents group within the meeting. So it's just in a time when we need to come together and to be able to spend time with each other, affirm and share the experiences that we are having in isolation in our meetings, and to be able to hear that it's not just you, that, you know, oh, as I'd said earlier when talking with my friend about my ministry and the frustration with my talk, was like, yeah, it's the same. So that's why the affinity spaces are important, so that it does give us an opportunity to come together and to share our common experiences with each other.
And the other piece of the question has to do with contemporary efforts toward contemporary abolition and reparation.
Okay, and so for the contemporary effort around abolition
and reparation,
right?
What do you see is the seed that we are planting or not within the process of transforming the religious society of France?
So I mean, one seed that I see is something that a project that you and I are both a part of, that is actually going to be starting on Friday, which is the Quaker Coalition for Undoing Racism, and a cohort that we have developed that is racial parity of folks of color and folks of European descent coming together with two great facilitators, Lisa Graustein and Neono Span, to start looking at racism within Quakerism in ways that we can address it. And we'll be doing that through June and coming together on a monthly basis. And, you know, I'm really excited about this opportunity to do that, and thankful that the American Friends Service Committee, Pentel Hill, and Friends Council on Education have joined FGC in providing this opportunity. And, you know, knowing that this will help plant a seed, and, you know, being creative and providing initiative, and also being willing to be in messy states. So in the sense that it is difficult to parse out our feelings sometimes. They get what our emotions say and what we know we should do are not always the same. So sometimes, even though we know that we should do something differently and try and do something differently, that it can be our emotions that hold us back. But I encourage us to continue and to acknowledge this is painful, this is hurtful, and I'm really scared to do this and frustrated, but I am still going to do my best to do this and not hold that in, to share that. Because also letting it out and sharing, and then also finding other people who are saying, oh, I'm feeling the same way, that'll be easier to take that risk, to step out, to change our practices, to change how our structures, and to look at money and how we spend our money. So, you know, Quakers have a lot of money, and a lot of that, as I had said, came from enslavement. And so what is our responsibility as the Religious Society of Friends around reallocating that money?
Vanessa, thank you so much. This evening has been a real pleasure and very, very informative. And you have presented us tonight with a lot of good, challenging proposal for us to keep exploring our history and to keep transforming our faith and practice, not just focusing on the Religious Society of Friends, but beyond Quakerism. And I really want to express my deep gratitude on behalf of Pendle Hill and on behalf of all the friends that has made possible the Cary lecture. I want to remind friends that all of you that are over Zoom and all of you that are on YouTube, that this lecture will be available in our YouTube channel, Pendle Hill USA. And our hope is that if you still have curiosity, that you revisit this lecture and that you engage with others in conversation about what we hear tonight as part of planting the seed and working toward the transformation that Vanessa is inviting us. Thank you so much. And I don't know if you have a final remark to share with us.
I don't. I just want to thank you very much for providing this opportunity. So it's been wonderful to be here and to spend time with everyone who's here. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you, friends, for being with us. Usually at the end of the lecture is when we try to open the mic for all of you to say goodbye. So we will do this now, and we hope that as you greet each other, we start saying again goodbye, and we will see you in our next event. Keep in tune at pendlehill.org.
Thank
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Francisco.
Everybody.
This has been wonderful, Vanessa.
Thank you, Vanessa, for the continued transformation.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Happy Monday.
That's just why
Good job. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Vanessa. Bye. Rest well, Vanessa.
Yes. Thank you.
nice and messy.